Alrighty, let's get started. Today on First Pass, we're taking another trip through the history of the UNSC Navy, but this time our journey will look at the noticeable lack of heavy direct combat warships used throughout the Human Covenant War. By analyzing the changing combat doctrines and facing the realities of wartime, we'll find out what happened to all the missing warships. Without further ado, before we dive right into lore's past, we should probably define what we mean by the lack of heavy direct fire warships. True, a lot of mainstay cruisers like the Marathon and Halcyon were very much active throughout the war, but when we look at larger tonnage vessels, it seems to jump straight to carriers and supercarriers. Intuitively, we see a gap in the tonnage bypassing anything resembling a battleship. A large and heavily armored warship meant to slug it out with other similarly large warships. Carriers can fit this role to a degree, if only by virtue of being fitted with max, but it's not their designed role. Alright, now back to actually answering our question. Much like our previous history lesson, our journey begins in the decades before the war, this time looking to 2493, with the rocky introduction of the Valiant class super heavy cruiser, which was designed as a compromise between the standard heavy cruiser, like the much later Marathon class, and a full-fledged battleship. The design was 1,518 meters long and equipped with a pair of heavy max, along with a massive arsenal of Archer missile pods, M810 Helix point defense guns, and over 100 Chiva nuclear missiles in certain vessels. It was built from the bottom up to dominate the battle space, through its sheer power and extreme durability. Despite being such a major powerhouse, the entire class was essentially decommissioned within 2 years of their introduction, due to their similarly extraordinary cost. That being said, within another 2 years, they were brought back into service to face the rising insurrection, where they would provide overwhelming firepower. At this point, the UNSC was facing a comparably inferior enemy. Simply put, they had the upper hand. They could control and exercise a more conventional military doctrine of using superior numbers and tonnage to control battles. Such a doctrine would have a critical role, that of a heavy direct combat warship that could augment fleets, one that the Valiant class could easily fill and excel at. Another lesser-known vessel in this no-man's land of tonnage was the Vindication class Light Battleship, with its first known appearance in 2525. Very little is known about the class besides its role is suspiciously similar to that of the Valiant class. Being a full 1,580 meters in length, it was barely larger than the Valiant, which leads to a hypothesis that it might have been meant as a replacement for it, but this is purely speculation. That being said, both classes are larger than the mainstay cruisers, though not quite a full-size battleship, though it doesn't hinder their ability to easily outmatch any insurrectionist threat. This naval superiority started to tip in the other direction with the Human Covenant War, starting in 2525. Despite limited victories in the first few years of the war, the UNSC tried continuing its previous doctrine of overwhelming firepower, but as the victories required larger and larger fleets, it also resulted in equally massive sacrifices to accomplish. Each victory ground away at its number of vessels and was drastically reduced to the point that large offensive operations were no longer viable, leading to a massive shift in doctrine in the early to mid-2530s. By now, the remaining fleet was engaged primarily in defensive operations around strategic and otherwise important worlds, and in a more mobile guerrilla-style warfare against Covenant for more limited offenses, trying to slow them down rather than defeat them outright. It became evident that one-on-one battles with the far superior Covenant warships was suicide for almost any single UNSC vessel, short of the absolutely massive carriers and supercarriers, particularly the Punic class. These 4-kilometer warships had several meters of armor and several max, which made them able to more or less fight Covenant capital ships, assuming similar or lesser tonnage. This role was akin to that of battleships, and by virtue of simply being massive enough to fight and survive. Despite their larger sizes, the Valiant and Vindication classes were still far behind the carriers in combat survivability, meaning that the role of heavy direct combat that they had been specifically designed for was no longer viable for their weight class, putting them into an odd limbo. Production of all these vessels for both carrier and not quite battleships alike was clearly astronomical, meaning that during the war, the ones fielded had to have been completed by or near the start of the war. As the UNSC was hemorrhaging vessels left and right, their shipyards shifted focus to the manufacture of frigates and destroyers. This shift was actually due to two major reasons: combat effectiveness and ease of manufacturing. Now you're probably, and rightfully, wondering why combat effectiveness would be one of the reasons. Simply put, they were effective due to their max, which was standard on all UNSC forces from frigates on up. Max were a cornerstone of UNSC combating Covenant forces, as they were the only other weapons besides nukes that could realistically pose a threat to enemy shielding. Mac volleys would bring down the shields, followed by a massive volley of Archer missiles, or more Mac rounds if possible, to destroy the vessel outright. No easy feat to accomplish even with the best of circumstances. Obviously, a single frigate is barely a threat to any Covenant vessel, but this changes when you take into account the same amount of resources used for a full-size cruiser, which could only field 1 or 2 max at best. You could potentially field over a dozen, or maybe even 24 frigates, each with their own max. Now, it's potentially 24 max instead of just a couple in a redundant and mobile fleet that can keep firing, even when half their forces are wiped out. However, as destroying half a cruiser leaves you with a hulking mass of half-molten titanium. Frigates were thus actively produced as fast as possible to replace vessels lost throughout the war. The Stalwart class was especially common, and with 16 being finished on the same day in 2547 around Reach. Even with the relative ease of production, the frigates and similarly sized destroyers also had a higher amount of maneuverability that aided in their survival. So now we've come back full circle. The largest vessels, aka the carriers, could hold their own to a degree, while the much smaller frigates and destroyers could outmaneuver enemies and be produced in large quantities. In the middle we have the cruisers and the not quite battleships. The cruisers managed to carve out an effective niche for themselves, as being relatively common enough to be used as the backbones and nominal command assets for most fleets and battle groups. This leaves us with the Valiant and Vindication classes respectively, too large and slow to be used in most fleets which required high levels of mobility, too costly and rare to be fielded in any meaningful numbers, and still too small to be able to truly compete with Covenant vessels head-on. So what roles does this leave them with? Honestly, it's a very niche role, primarily as command assets for only the largest of fleets and as heavy defensive assets at strategic locations such as at Reach or on Earth, though this was also often filled by carriers too, as per availability. Given such a small list of potential roles that could also be filled by other vessels, this left the two classes being sidelined for much of the war, as their already small numbers were further reduced. Luckily though, the Vindication class managed to gain a new lease on life post-war, as several more can be seen fielded by the resurgent UNSC, very likely meaning that they are being actively manufactured once again. With that, we've gone through the history to find out what happened to the Valiant and Vindication classes. If you have ideas or suggestions for other ships or verses, please comment below. Thank you very much for watching, I do hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe for more content, and remember, this was your first pass at what happened to the missing heavy warships.